I'm going to talk about mixing, what may mix and what may not mix, which maybe sometimes is something to think about just in terms of who we mix with, but that's not what we're learning today. So, what does the Torah tell us may not be mixed together?
Say that again, sorry.
What does the Torah tell us may not be mixed together?
Milk and meat.
Milk and meat, that's one. Shatnez is another one. Wool and linen. What else? Okay, so we'll start with shatnez because it's in today's parasha, or in this week's parasha. So shatnez is a mixture of wool and linen. In order to transgress the Torah's prohibition against shatnez, it has to be that the wool and the linen are literally linked into each other, so sewn into the same garment, or maybe even laced into the same garment, even if it's not as permanent as sewing. But theoretically, if you just had one piece of material that was wool and a different piece of material that was linen, and you put them on top of each other, that technically would not be the problem, unless it's a very soft material and the fibers can actually mix. Okay? So that's shatnez, right? Shatnez is a mixture of wool and linen. In this parasha, we're also going to talk about two other kinds of forbidden mixtures. One of them is grafting different kinds of plants together. Now, the similarity between the two is there's nothing wrong with wool on its own. There's nothing wrong with linen on its own. It's only once you mix the two of them together, that's when it becomes a problem. So in the same way, you could have two types of produce. There's no such thing as a plant that's not kosher. So you've got two kinds of produce, but once you graft them together, now you've got a problem. Okay? Now you've got a problem.
Is that anywhere in the world?
Good question. So as far as the Torah is concerned, the prohibition against grafting different kinds of produce is only in Israel. And also, rabbinically we apply it internationally, but the prohibition is only against the act of grafting the two products. But if somebody already did the work, you're allowed to benefit from the result. So if there's some kind of a fruit that is the result of crossbreeding, of course, exactly,
You can eat it.
you can eat it. That's not a problem. Prohibition is only against the actual grafting itself. The third example is that you're not allowed to crossbreed different species of animals, and that's even if both animals are kosher. So again, I'm reiterating the point that each item on its own would be fine. It's only when you mix them together, that's when you have a problem. In fact, the prohibition against crossbreeding animals is so severe that the Torah tells us you're not even allowed to plow with, the example the Torah gives is an ox and a donkey pulling the same plow. So that's how careful you have to be not to crossbreed animals. You can't even have them working together. And even though there are commentaries who say there's another reason why you can't have them working together, because they'll pull with different strengths and it's going to be undue stress on one of the animals. But there are other commentaries that say because animals that work together are generally housed together, and that's going to create the possibility of crossbreeding. So that's why you're not allowed to do it. Okay, so those are the three that are spoken about in this parasha. The other one, as Steve said right at the beginning, is the prohibition against the mixture of meat and milk. Now, again, it's the same principle. In order to transgress the prohibition against meat and milk, the meat has to be kosher and the milk has to be kosher. So in all four of these scenarios, each item independently is fine. Problem is only when you mix them together. So you can see that there's a thread that runs through all of them. There's a lot of similarity to permitted items that you're not allowed to mix. And if you do mix, at least in certain circumstances, you have a resulting problem. Next question. Where are you allowed to have shatnez? Because we just said a broad-based statement that you're not allowed to have shatnez. You're not allowed to have a garment that is a mixture of wool and linen. So my question is, that's not entirely true. There are scenarios where you're permitted to have shatnez. In fact, there's even one scenario where you are required to have shatnez. Does anybody know what that is? What they are? Okay? So, when the Torah tells us the prohibition against shatnez, straight after that, it tells us Gedilim taseh lo challah b'kanfos kususcha, that you have to put tzitzis on the four corners of your garments. The fact that the two mitzvahs are put right next to each other, that teaches us that you're allowed to make tzitzis that are shatnez. In other words, you could, for example, have a linen garment with woolen tzitzis on the corners. So that would technically be a transgression against shatnez, but you're allowed to do it. Why? Because the Torah presented the two mitzvahs juxtaposed one next to the other. It wanted to illustrate to us that the prohibition of shatnez is overridden when there's a mitzvah to do. That's interesting, right? Not only that, but like I said, there's one scenario where you are required to use shatnez. Anybody know what that is?
The blue thread in that.
No, the blue thread is also wool. It's just dyed. So where would you have an obligation to have shatnez? Now, nobody really knows this because it's not something that is part of our lives currently. So it's very abstract for us. What's that? Getting warmer.
What did you say?
So the Mishkan, right? So getting closer, getting warmer. In the uniform of the Kohanim, they had 4 items that they had to wear. There was a hat, a shirt, breeches, and a belt. The belt had to be made out of shatnez. It's a requirement of the Torah that the belt had to be made out of shatnez, which is fascinating, right? Because it sounds so strange that the Torah should tell you something is forbidden, and then in the context of a mitzvah, it might be permitted or even required. It's very strange. Okay. So now, let's use that logic and apply it to the others. When it comes to the forbidden mixture of different kinds of products, right? Produce. So you're not allowed to, for example, plant your wheat under your vine, as an example. That's one that the Torah says very clearly. Right? You can't graft 2 types of plants together. Are you aware of any scenario where if it's for a mitzvah, you're allowed to do that? No such thing. There is nowhere in the context of serving Hashem that you are permitted and certainly not required to graft 2 products together. For sure not. Same thing applies to animals, right? So there's a prohibition against crossbreeding animals. Nowhere in the Torah is there a mitzvah that allows us to crossbreed an animal. So what we're seeing here is that shatnez clearly is different in some way, even though fundamentally it's the same concept, that you're not allowed to breed or mix 2 different kinds of items together. Somehow shatnez is different. So we need to understand why shatnez is different. Okay. So far we got 2 categories. Shatnez, forbidden, except if it's in the context of specific mitzvahs. Crossbreeding animals or grafting plants, always forbidden regardless. Now let's look at a 3rd category. So one of the midrashim is called the Mechilta. And the Mechilta has a very interesting debate, it's discussion, where it says, okay, you're not allowed to mix meat and milk. We know that, right? But let me ask you, as far as the Torah is concerned, at which point is it considered a mixture of meat and milk? In other words, if I don't know the halacha, maybe I think I have to have 2 separate shelves in the freezer. One for meat products, one for dairy products. Is that the halacha? No, it's not. So at which point, halachically, does a mixture of meat and milk become a problem? Again, shatnez, when does it become a problem? When the fibers intertwine, whether that's through sewing or whether it's soft materials that just mix. So at which point does meat and milk become a problem as far as the Torah is concerned?
More than 1 in 60.
More than 1. So what does that mean? If I have 60 steaks in the freezer and then I put in 1 block of cheese, that's okay. Whereas if I had 50 steaks in the freezer and I put in 1 block of cheese, is that not okay?
Yeah.
But it's in the freezer. There's no...
Oh, no, not in the
cooking.
No,
So cooking is the key,
course.
right? Okay, so cooking is the key. That the Torah actually uses the expression when it tells us about the prohibition against meat and milk. It specifically uses do not cook, right? Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So it's, as far as the Torah is concerned, the real issue is cooking. Yes, once it is cooked, I'm not allowed to eat it. Once it is cooked, I'm not allowed to have any benefit from it. I can't sell it. I can't give it away as a gift, etc., etc. But the fact is that the Torah speaks specifically in the context of cooking. So here's what the Mechilta says. The Mechilta says, maybe, if it's in the context of not just an ordinary mitzvah, but maybe if it's in the context of bringing an offering in the Beis HaMikdash, which is an uber mitzvah, if you think about it, because you're coming into Hashem's home and you're doing something which is so powerful and so spiritual, etc., maybe in that context, you should be allowed to have a mixture of meat and milk. Similar to the idea that shatnez, in the context of the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim, who wear their uniforms only when they're on duty, so only inside the Beis HaMikdash, there's an obligation to mix the wool and linen. maybe there's a similar, if not an obligation, at least an opportunity that you're allowed to mix meat and milk when cooking something which is a sacrifice, which is part of the holy service in the Beis Hamikdash. So the Mechilta says you would have thought that that's the case. Because you would have thought that that's the case, the Torah goes out of its way to address that is not the case. How does the Torah do that? Because the Torah tells us as follows. The Torah tells us about various gifts that a person has to bring to the Beis Hamikdash as a dedication to Hashem. Straight after that, immediately after it discusses the things that you're supposed to bring as a gift to the Beis Hamikdash, in other words, the offerings that are supposed to go into the Beis Hamikdash, the very next thing that the Torah says is, Loi sevashel gedi b'chalei v'moi, that you may not cook a kid in its mother's milk. In other words, the Torah made a point of reiterating the prohibition against cooking a mixture of meat and dairy straight after telling us about the mitzvah to bring things as an offering to the Beis Hamikdash. Why did it do that? Says the Mechilta, because clearly you need to know that in the Beis Hamikdash you're not permitted to mix meat and dairy. You would have thought that you are allowed to. Now you have to know that you're not. So that means we have three categories in this concept of forbidden mixtures. Remember, what's common to all of these scenarios is each of the two materials or items are acceptable, are permitted on their own. The problem only begins when I mix them. So I would have thought they all operate in the same way because they're all basically the same principle. Don't mix two things together if the Torah tells you that they may not be mixed. So you think that they're identical. But now that we've looked at this, we see they're not identical at all. There are actually three categories. The first category, which is the one that Shatnez falls into, is you're not allowed to make the mixture except in certain mitzvah circumstances. So for tzitzis, it's permitted, and in the uniform of the Kohanim, it is required. The second scenario is the exact opposite. The second category is the exact opposite. That is the mixture of either produce or animals. There, it is absolutely clear to us that you can, under no circumstances, ever mix them together. In fact, it's so obvious that the Torah doesn't even have to address that maybe you'd think there's a mitzvah where you could do this, and we have to clarify it's not the case. And then in between the two, you've got meat and milk, where for whatever reason, the Torah believes you would have thought that it's acceptable to mix the two of them, and therefore the Torah had to tell you that it's not. Okay, so we now have to understand what is the reason behind these three categories. And the one that's going to intrigue us really the most is Shatnez, because it really sounds strange. Where else in the Torah do you have something where the Torah says, this is not allowed, unless it's a mitzvah? It's very unusual. I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all in the Torah. For example, the Torah tells us that a man may never marry his brother's wife, even if the brother divorces her, even if the brother passes away. Yet, the Torah tells us there's a mitzvah that if the brother passes away without children, then the brother should take the wife in order to continue the family name. So there are examples where the Torah says something is forbidden and then creates a mitzvah around it. But it is rare, it is unusual, and what makes it really unusual in this case is you've got four scenarios that all seem to be so similar, and yet you've got such a big difference between them, so we need to understand where that difference comes from. So our first clue, before we can really start to unpack this, our first clue comes from the insight, the commentary of the Ramban. Okay, not to be confused with the Rambam. So the Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. The Ramban is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. The Rambam is most well known for his halachic contribution to Judaism because he made the Mishnah Torah, which is 14-volume encyclopedia of Jewish law. Besides, obviously, his other philosophical contributions like the Guide to the Perplexed and the letters that he wrote to address various issues that plagued the community at the time. But his primary contribution to Judaism is halachic. The Ramban's primary contribution to Judaism is explanations on the Torah. So his commentary on the Chumash is a very beautiful and very important commentary for people to learn if you really want to understand the Chumash. So the Ramban addresses this in his question about the Chumash, and what he says is something very, very interesting. He asks the question, which of all of these categories, well, let's leave the meat and milk for now, because we're going to first talk about the ones that are addressed in a row, because the Torah tells us all of these together. Shatnez, crossbreeding, and grafting. They're all told in the same context, so they must be the closest to each other. So the Ramban says, out of the three of them, the prohibition against crossbreeding animals, grafting plants, or mixing wool and linen, which would you have the most difficult time trying to explain to somebody who knows nothing about Judaism?
Grafting.
I would say so as well.
Right? Why would you say grafting?
Because agriculturally they use grafting to enhance the growth of the plant, not just mixing fruit.
Okay, fair enough. Good point. The Ramban says the most difficult one to explain would be shatnez, wool and linen, because there's absolutely no logic to that mitzvah.
Yeah, there's no commonality, Linen is grown from the ground,
Exactly.
and a sheep.
Exactly. So let's go back. If you're talking about crossbreeding animals, animals are animals. They live in the same, well, they're not the same species. That's the point. You can't breed different species, but they're in the same class of life, animal and animal. If you're talking about grafting plants, they're in the same class of life, plant kingdom. Whereas when you talk about shatnez, you're talking about two different realities altogether. Okay, one is plant, linen, and one is animal, wool. But it goes beyond that. Listen to what the Ramban says, because it's absolutely fascinating. It says, if you go back to the beginning of the Torah, when we're told about creation, one of the things that is reiterated each time that animals, birds, fish, and plants, specifically animals, birds, and fish, you see it most clearly, when they're created, Hashem makes a point of saying they were created according to their species. Le minehem. They were created according to their species. In other words, Hashem decided that there have to be diverse species on earth. And therefore Hashem, because think about it, Hashem could have created the world in any which way he wanted. So all animals could have been a single species. All birds could have been a single species. But he didn't. He specifically created a diversity of species. And because of that, we don't have the right, says the Ramban, to interfere with what Hashem has designed. So let's say, for example, a person takes a horse and a donkey, and they crossbreed them. What do you get?
A mule.
You get a mule. What's different between a mule and most other animals?
Mule can't breed.
A mule can't breed. And that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. The point is, Hashem designed the world in such a way that every species not only should be identified as its own species, but every species should be able to perpetuate its species. Now, when the human being gets involved and decides, what we're going to do? We're going to take two different animals and we're going to mix them together. What we've effectively done is we've now stunted the development of those two species. Okay, of course the species will continue, but in these two animals that we've engaged with, we've stunted their growth. They can no longer perpetuate. There would be no lineage from those two animals. So we've disturbed Hashem's rules of nature. We've disturbed Hashem's creation. The Ramban says you can explain that to a person and they would understand it. It's logical, it's relatable, it's the easiest one to explain. It's why you should not be allowed to crossbreed. Because who are you to interfere with Hashem's creation? Hashem wanted these various species. He wanted the species to perpetuate, and therefore it's inappropriate that we should do anything to not only interfere with that, but actually to reverse it. Because that's the result of crossbreeding animals. We reverse the way that Hashem created the world. In the case of plants, it's not as clear, because the reality is if you do graft different plants together, you could actually improve and stimulate the growth of one of the plants.
You know what I find amazing? The Torah was written a while ago. Grafting is relatively new.
Well, the way in which we graft is relatively new, but the idea...
the Torah took care of it 5,700 years ago.
Right. But just bear in mind that growing different products very close together would already cause root systems to intermingle and whatever. There was already some degree of grafting that was available back then. It wasn't as scientific as it is now. Plus, you could always cut, different. You could cut a plant and kind of, intermingle.
Yeah, but
there were rudimentary
that's what
versions.
is now.
Correct. I'm saying there were rudimentary versions of grafting that were available then. The point is that when it comes to grafting different plants together, obviously it's not as stark as crossbreeding animals, where you're stopping the ability of this particular animal to breed. But in the case of plants, what you are doing is you're saying, I'm dissatisfied with the way that Hashem designed the species, and I'm going to now create a new species or a super species, which, by the way, if you go with the Ramban's logic, the whole concept of GM foods is a problem, philosophically, according to the Ramban. Meddling and modifying plant life. Now, that's not necessarily the halachic reality. The halachic reality is that we're allowed to modify. That's why we're supposed to innovate and we're supposed to engage in science. But specifically, the idea of grafting is to change the species. The Torah kept saying everything was created according to its species. So to create the species is something that we are not supposed to do, and people can accept that. They can understand that logically. However, when it comes to the mixture of wool and linen, it is absolutely arbitrary. There will be zero consequence of mixing wool and linen. Once you've taken the flax out of the ground, it's not going to grow anyway. Once you've sheared the wool off the sheep, the wool is still going to grow on the sheep. This wool is not getting any bigger or smaller because you sheared it from the sheep. Nothing's going to change. Plus, you're not modifying the species in any way. All you're doing is you're taking threads of wool and threads of linen and you're stitching them together. That doesn't modify the species. How do I know it doesn't modify the species? Because I can undo it. Once you've grafted the plant, you can no longer undo the fruit. Once you've crossbred the animal, you can no longer undo the mule. But if a person stitched together wool and linen, at any time you could identify where the wool and linen are. And by the way, that's what they do in Shatner's laboratories, where they test, if you buy a suit, for example, you want to be sure that there's no linen in your wool suit, so you send it off to the Shatner's laboratory, and they have a very simple process. They just apply a dye, because the Rambam actually says this, that the way to identify wool and linen in a garment is that wool and linen will respond differently to dyes. So if you put a bit of dye in the places you anticipate that there might be linen, like for example in the stitching under the collar, which is a very common place, it will immediately show up, and then you just pick out the linen and you're good. So logically, what's the problem? Nothing's changing. You're not interfering with Hashem's creation of species. It's a decision that you can undo without any harm. Why would shatnez be such a problem? Therefore, the Ramban says, shatnez is the one that is the most difficult to try and rationalize to somebody who knows nothing about the Torah. That bit of information, that shatnez is such a low-grade mixture compared to the other kinds of mixtures, maybe that holds the clue to understanding why shatnez could change in the context of a mitzvah, like tzitzis, or the Kohen's uniform, whereas the others are always forbidden. Well, let's see if that's the whole story.